focused on drug crimes. He was an FBI supervisory special agent fighting political corruption and supporting global counterterrorism efforts. Congresswoman Luria, also with an amazing background, protecting us, keeping us safe. She represents Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. Before she was elected in 2018, she served 2 decades in the Navy, where she retired at as the rank of commander. Today, she's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. She was actually the first woman in the Navy's nuclear power program and among the first women to serve the entirety of her career in combatant ships. So we're very lucky to have you both. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to ask you both, Congressman and Congresswoman, do we have your permission to, if I remind you of our time limits here along the way? So if members of Congress are known to talk for a long time sometimes, so if I have to cut you off, don't take it personally. Is that okay?
Yes, please, Brian, keep us honest. We will take your cues.
Okay. Well, let's get started here. Both of you are members of the Problem Solvers Caucus. Would love to hear from both of you what drew you to this group and how you're trying to bring the Congress and the country together at this uniquely divided moment. Congresswoman Luria, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you again to Braver Angels and No Labels and all of the folks who are taking the time to participate in this conversation. I only wish that we could spread this to millions of people, which is ultimately our goal, to end this divisiveness and bring more people together to talk through difficult issues. Well, Brian mentioned a little bit about my bio. I did spend 20 years in the Navy, and I think being an officer in the military is an inherently nonpartisan thing. So I think of myself, deployed on an aircraft carrier, and we're launching strikes against terrorist targets in Iraq or Afghanistan. I didn't turn to the sailor operating the nuclear reactor and say, a Democrat or you a Republican. It was truly about getting a mission done. So that's really how I've always approached those kind of things. And even a funnier point about it is when I ran for office in 2018, I had actually voted in 2016 for the person I ultimately ran against. So have really thought of myself as not necessarily adhering to, strictly to one political party along the way, and just came to Congress looking for people I could work with on whatever that issue might be. And, really have found a home in Problem Solvers to be able to connect with other people who are really looking to have substantive conversations about issues and find solutions to things. And people always ask me, is this crazy in Washington as we see on TV? And I like to tell them about the problem solvers, because the truth is, it might not make the headlines, but there are so many of us who are looking to work together and find solutions. And if you think about at the very end of the last administration, the COVID package that we passed, the framework and the foundation of that came out of our caucus, working with our Senate colleagues to find something that we could agree on, that we could compromise, but still find solutions for the American people. And my hope, I'm sure, along with Brian, is that we can continue to move forward and have more successes like that as a caucus.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Congressman Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, John. Elaine, great to see you. And, to both Braver Angels and No Labels, thanks for coming together. 2 great organizations to have our little chat tonight. And I think we're all here because we hold the shared belief that unification is everything. It's what our country so desperately needs right now. And, just to echo what Elaine just said, I think one of the many things Elaine and I have in common, we both came out of professions where people relied on us to come together. Life or death situations depended on it. Elaine referenced her time in the Navy, when, anytime in the FBI, when we had any kind of time sensitive crime problem, whether it be a kidnapping or a terrorist cell or anything in between, we came together and we actively sought diversity around that table. Diversity of thought, people from different educational backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, coming from different parts of the country, different regions of the world. We viewed that diversity of thought as a strength to be harnessed, not a weakness to be criticized. And that's really what attracted me to No Labels and to the Problem Solvers upon my entry to Congress. It was the first group I met with. It was the first caucus I signed up for. And I couldn't agree more with what Elaine said. We feel like we have a home there because, and I know Elaine feels the same way, those of us that come to Congress, and you've probably heard the adage that there's two types of members of Congress. You have workhorses and you have show horses. We're the workhorses. We're not the ones that you're gonna see on cable TV every night. We're not out there trying to attract likes or retweets or clicks or views on YouTube. We're actually there to try to solve a problem or multiple problems. The big problem that Elaine and I both agree needs to be fixed is the hyperpartisanship, the divisiveness that can't sustain in any organization, whether it be a family or a military unit or a sports team or a company, and it certainly can't sustain itself in Congress. So I agree with Ryan that this movement has gone from an important movement to an existential movement. It's incredibly time sensitive, and that's why I'm proud to be a part of it. So appreciate you guys having me and Elaine on. One of the things you'll see in common from Elaine and I, we're not bomb throwers. You're never going to hear us on the floor of the House attacking an entire party. You're never going to hear us attacking colleagues by name, because if you're a representative of your people, you know that you need to bring everybody together just to represent your district, in addition to solving the country's problems. So that's what we believe in. I yield back.
One quick follow-up question before we hand it off to John. Well, we just have a couple of minutes here in this segment. Could both of you just talk a little bit about the pressures inside Washington that make what you're trying to do so hard? I mean, I suspect everybody on this call is familiar with, Fox News and MSNBC, and the whole media ecosystem doesn't exactly reward this. But maybe give us a sense of, especially post January 6th, what is going on the Hill that is making it so hard to reach toward this goal of unity everybody seems to be saying they want to reach for? Congresswoman, maybe you could start.
Sure. Well, echo back to what I said a little bit earlier is that, I think what gets reflected in the news, and it is kind of what Brian said, it's, there's the workhorses and the show horses. So you have people, I think, really at both extremes in both parties, who really have an objective of being heard, more so in my mind in a lot of cases than getting things done. And so, if you're watching the national news and you're in that echo chamber in either network, there's kind of, different points of view that are emphasized on different networks. I think you're only going to hear that perspective. But the truth is, behind the scenes, we are meeting together for coffee late at night in an empty House office building conference room to talk about infrastructure, or we're doing our Zooms early in the morning, talking to CEOs of major corporations and employers about how they're getting through COVID. I mean, we're doing this work day in and day out. And, I think one of the most unfortunate things is it's just not seen as much by the public. And I also think, the committees that we serve on sometimes are just inherently bipartisan. I serve as the vice chair of the Armed Services Committee and as a subcommittee chair on Veterans Affairs. And, when I first came to Congress, both committee chairmen said, "Welcome to the most bipartisan committee in all of Congress." And, I would say that, that has carried forward, and we've done a lot of good work to get veterans their benefits. Last year, we passed the National Defense Authorization Act, so the defense bill, out of committee unanimously. And that is really the norm because, we work those things out behind the scenes and come to a consensus to provide a product, that we can agree on. And, we'd obviously like to see more of that. That doesn't happen in every committee or with every member, but, I think Brian and I feel like we can set that example. We've brought even more new members in this Congress than we had last Congress, which, with kind of the mood that you're describing, in the news and on TV, might be surprising that our caucus has actually grown. Sure.
Congressman, anything you'd add there on just the pressures about what makes it hard?
Yeah. I came in as part of the 115th Congress freshman class. Elaine was the next class. And one thing that we always talked about was, we all went down to, it was after the election, but before we got sworn in, went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Everybody's families got to meet each other. We got to spend time off the Hill getting to know one another before we even got sworn in. And then the second you get sworn in, they start to divide you. They divide you in different rooms for your conference meetings. They divide you physically on the floor. People sit on different sides of the chamber for the State of the Union. Everything is divide and division. It's part of the model. And it's very striking, particularly to those of us who came in to Congress without any previous political experience, as Elaine and I have. It's very odd to us because it's not like anything that's normal in any other aspect of life. And that's really what our caucus is fighting against. And it exists in both parties. There's a sort of a baked in model of, if you stick together, that's a sign of strength. And by sticking together, party leaders mean sticking together in your caucus. What our caucus believes in, the problem solvers, we also believe in sticking together. We have a caucus rule that if 75% of the caucus agrees to a principle or a bill, as well as 50% of each party's respective members of the caucus, we agree to stick together as a block. And that's what we think is important as far as sticking together, is the moderate Republicans, the moderate Democrats sticking together in unison, representing the silent majority of voters out there, the people that aren't protesting every day, the people that aren't appearing on cable news every day, but the people that show up and they go to work and they raise their families and they just want a government that functions the way their family does.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Congressman. John, let me hand it over to you for the next question.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Congressman Fitzpatrick partially preempted, I think, the question I was going to ask, which is just fine because you guys can both elaborate a little bit further. But gridlock, the idea of gridlock is something that for most Americans, I think, is a real albatross around the neck of Congress's popularity, particularly when it comes to the inability of Democrats and Republicans in Congress to come together on issues that are of immediate and vital importance to the American people. Now, the Problem Solvers Caucus has a reputation of sort of bucking that trend and reaching out across the aisle to navigate past the divide and break the gridlock. But on a tangible level, what does it mean? You started to speak to it a little bit there at the end, Congressman Fitzpatrick, but what does it mean for the Problem Solvers Caucus to put forward a policy recommendation? Does that mean that there's lockstep agreement, or could there be quite a bit of divergence? What role, for both of you, what role does compromise play in the Problem Solvers process for producing recommendations on policy?
Should I start with that, sir?
Go for it, by all means.
Okay. Yeah, I would say the paradigm that we all share in the Problem Solvers is that we view diversity of thought as a strength and not a weakness. We all share the paradigm that you grow and you learn when you surround yourself with people who are different than you, when you travel to different places that are different from anything you've ever experienced in life, when you expand your brain and cross-examine and challenge your own paradigms that you've grown up with and that you've learned. That's where the growing occurs. I think we all share that in common, is we like being around each other to hear our different perspectives on how to best solve a problem, because it starts with the premise that we all love America and we all want the same thing. We may have different ways of getting to that end goal. And we want to hear that because Elaine, more often than not, will have a better idea than I have. And I want to hear from her. I want to hear from her perspective, just like I want to hear from all my colleagues and learn and create that best practice or that best legislative product that we can use to solve a problem, whether it be prison reform or immigration or healthcare or whatever it may be. But to answer your other question, John, yeah, and basically what we saw, the Freedom Caucus, the far, the very conservative caucus in the Republican conference, they voted as a block, and they were able to really have a significant, and I would argue, a very adversarial role to play as far as getting things across the finish line. We wanted to have that same strength, so we modified our rules in the 115th Congress to say that if the majority of us can agree to something, we're going to agree to vote as a block. And there's always exceptions. If you have a very significant district issue that would cause a problem, then we obviously make room for that consideration. But we didn't just want to be a coffee club. We didn't want to be a discussion group. We wanted to be disruptors. And when I say disruptors, I mean disruptors in a good way. Disruptors to the status quo, disruptors to the gridlock, because we felt that our presence was needed in an increasingly polarized, hyper-partisan environment.
And Congresswoman Luria, fellow constructive disruptor, is there anything you'd like to add to Brian's answer to that question?
Well, honestly, I don't think I could have said it better. But I think that Brian mentioned the Freedom Caucus and his party, and we have a lot of the very progressive folks on the far left of our party, and I think that the majority of people in this country are truly somewhere in the middle. And being able to come together and like be standing on either side of that line, we're the aisle, across the aisle from red to blue, but we're talking to each other and we're sharing those views and those opinions. And, coming to a compromise or finding common ground is not a bad thing versus gridlock, right? So you're not, you find in this job, you're never gonna make everyone happy all the time, right? And so the fact that we have such a large group, Brian, you can correct me, what are there, 52 of us this Congress? It just keeps growing, so I've lost track. But 52 of us who are willing to come together, sit around the table and talk through these issues. It's something that I don't think the majority of the American people see or understand that is happening, and it does inform legislation that goes forward. And, going into COVID, the first 4 major COVID bills that we passed were either unanimous or broadly bipartisan. And then we got to the one, right before the end of the last administration. And that's one where it really took some muscle, because I think that urgency to act immediately and the pressure of an election and all of these other things, made it hard and just kept delaying it. But I think as a group, we were persistent. We found senators on the other side of the building who were also persistent to work together in a bipartisan manner. And, we got a product through that got help to American people who needed. There was additional stimulus payments. There was additional funding for testing, for shots in arms, to help schools reopen. And those are all things that are key things that everyone agrees on. So, I think it just takes persistence and folks who are really willing to come together and work together to get there. So I'm proud to be part of the group and glad to be here to talk about the work that we're doing.
Absolutely. And as just a quick follow on to that, I think that you've got folks who obviously are supporters of No Labels and many of our members at Braver Angels, but well beyond our organizations, who would like to be supportive of politicians and members of Congress who are willing to extend that olive branch and who are willing to put, people before parties, so to speak, in advocating for the interests of Americans. Is there a useful index or sort of tracking or rating system? Obviously, many advocacy groups will rate politicians on their sort of alignment with one policy agenda or the other. When it comes to members of Congress who are working together constructively in a bipartisan fashion to advance the common good, is there an index or some resource that our viewers here can be made aware of that would allow them to keep up with members of Congress such as yourselves who are setting that positive example?
Well, John, there's several places, where you can see how individual members of Congress voted, and then you can also compare them against other members or against, the average for their party based off of which platform. So, not to endorse, any particular one over the other, but the congress.gov is the US government site of all legislation. It can show you who co-sponsored a bill, how each member of Congress voted on it. You can really go down in the weeds and see like every amendment that was made to that bill through the process. And so that's the official government website, congress.gov. There's also a group called GovTrack, and they have some very interesting statistics. They take all of the information and you can do some comparisons there. The Lugar Center does a bipartisan index. So that's another one where you can judge bipartisanship. And, there's a lot of things in these different, websites that are somewhat hard to track, because of the fact that they don't all track every procedural vote or every amendment or different things like that. But I think if you look up your member of Congress, for example, you can get a really good idea of the things that they voted for, the things they voted against. And, members of Congress themselves, if they're out there talking about the fact that bipartisanship and working across the aisle is important to them, I think that's also a good sign as well. I bring it up all the time. 85% of the bills that I co-sponsored are bipartisan, and I really try to talk about that because, people perk up, if there are people who might, not necessarily think that they're going to be supportive of me or my viewpoints, and they know that, the vast majority of the bills that I co-sponsored, I've, worked with a Republican on, I think that opens their ears and makes them want to listen a little more.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. And Ryan, over to you. I think you've got another one ready to go.
I do. The people on this call are so grateful, not only for both of your time tonight, but they're really eager to help you. And the Problem Solvers Caucus more generally bring this idea of two-party governance back to DC, but they just don't know how to do it. Or maybe there's just so many choices, they don't really know what would work. So can you talk about some ways that your constituents interact with you and that you find helpful in not only understanding their issues and concerns, but maybe the kind of engagement that compels you to act on their concerns? Congresswoman Luria, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think that every interaction I have every day in my congressional district is something that I take something away from, whether I, chat with somebody while I'm getting gas or in the line to pay for groceries. I hear what's on people's mind and I learn a lot from that. So there's just very informal ways. And obviously the district's very big. There's 750,000 people, so I'm not going to get a chance to chat with everybody in the checkout line. But, we receive emails from people in the district, we receive letters, we get phone calls, and, our legislative team and our district office team, they track all of that. When there's an important vote coming up, they do a report and they let me know every day, the pros, the cons, the views that people had. And, we also try to respond to every message that we get, either in writing via the mail or via an email, depending on how we received the message. And then, there's an opportunity, and especially before COVID, it was a lot easier, to get people together in a setting of a town hall, where you can meet face to face, do a quick question and answer. And then there's all kinds of community events. And I'm sure Brian is just like me, if you're not at a parade or at church or at a Boy Scout picnic, just kind of be everywhere and visit folks, visit businesses, manufacturing farms, learn about the work they're doing. So there's always an opportunity to interact with people. And I would tell you, every one of those visits I have, I take something away, something that I learn about how people feel and how they're doing in the district, but also, legislative things that we can go back and work on to help make their businesses run more smoothly, or, fix a problem with, an agriculture issue like, runoff water into the Chesapeake Bay, and how that's increasing sediment and nitrogen levels, those kind of things. I mean, you don't think that you really spend a lot of time thinking about chicken farms in Accomack County and how that affects the Chesapeake Bay, but after you go visit a chicken farm, you kind of you learn a lot about it, and you really know that that's an important issue for a lot of people, both the chicken farmers and the people who subsist off of fishing and oysters in the bay. So the truth is, every interaction I have, I take something away from it. But the more formal ways are those correspondence and, showing up for town halls, either in person or virtual.
Congressman, maybe one of the things you could also talk about is obviously since the pandemic started, there's a lot less opportunity for in-person interaction. So, I mean, are there also creative ways, through forums like this that you've been using to make sure you're staying in touch with your constituents?
For sure. Obviously a lot has changed as far as interactions and events since COVID. So we're using Zoom a lot more. We do a lot of telephone town halls. You just have to be creative. As Elaine said, we have 750,000 constituents, and it's our job to, be the collective voice for all of them. And in order to do that, you got to be able to hear from them and know what's important and what isn't. And that involves getting outside of the echo chamber of DC physically as well. As soon as votes are done, getting on, for me, the Amtrak train, or, Elaine driving, or, training or flying or wherever, to make sure you get back home to your bosses. That's where you're going to hear real life problems. That's where you're going to get real advice, whether it be in the produce aisle of the supermarket or outside of church or on the sideline of the soccer field. And one thing that we still try to do, albeit virtually now, but we've always liked to do a lot of business visits to hear from business owners, small business owners running all industries, of what struggles are facing, visiting our farmers, visiting our high schools and our grade schools, visiting our churches. That's where you hear from real people that are expressing what they're experiencing and what we can do legislatively or otherwise to try to solve that. Another thing, Ryan, that we've done in our district is we sort of have our own little problem solvers caucus. So just like we have our caucus in DC where it's a 1-to-1 ratio, we've replicated that here in our district where we have our own local district version of the problem solvers. People really embrace it. They engage tremendously in it. So when we do things like district swaps, Tom Swazi, Josh Gottheimer, Dan Kildee, Connor Lamb, so many of my Democrat colleagues, we've done that where I've gone to their district, they've come to mine. And I always make that one of the stops of the day. We have our local problem solvers caucus meeting where they get to chat with a member from another district, and they get to see kind of what Elaine and I are doing now. They get to, at least pre-COVID, experience that in person, and hopefully we can restart that soon as well. But just trying to be creative on how we communicate, and most important, how we listen, because that's the most important thing that Elaine and I can do, is not being lecturing all the time, not telling people things. Clearly, we have to give them an update of what we're seeing and hearing in DC, but spend a lot more time listening to the voices.
Gotcha. One follow-up question for you. I mean, this is great in understanding how you're, staying in touch with your constituents and keeping them engaged. But if we could just turn really quickly to issues. And look, obviously, this COVID relief bill that just passed, kind of reminded people of how things have typically passed in Washington in the last couple of years. Really no meaningful support from the other side of the aisle. As you look as to what comes next, where do you see an opening to finally really get some two-party solutions here in the coming weeks and months? Woman Luria, maybe we could start with you. Where are you really focusing on as a chance for a bipartisan breakthrough?
Sure. Well, I was disappointed that with the most recent COVID relief package, we weren't able to, take the time, come together, do it in a bipartisan way, and really work through it like we had on the preceding one. But, I also felt a serious urgency to get shots out to people, to get the vaccines out and try to get schools open and a lot of other things that were, in the bill. So it's disappointing when we can't work together out the gate. And, I am looking for more opportunities to do that. We just had 2 votes this week, and I don't know off the top of my head how Brian voted, but I can pretty well guess. We voted on the Dreamers, HR 6, the Dream and Promise Act for, children who came here as, young children and really haven't had a way to establish permanent residency and have been afraid of, their future, to be able to protect them. And there was also Farm Workers Modernization Act, which was another, fix to some immigration issues relative specifically to agriculture, farm work, dairy workers, and some other things that we had worked through last Congress in the Problem Solvers Caucus, and that got 30 Republican votes. So, there are things that, are continuing to come through on a regular basis, where we are finding that, bipartisan support for those things. And then, there's just a lot of things that we pass on what's called suspensions, which basically it is a bill where, neither party demands to have a recorded vote, i.e. we don't, record by name each one who votes for it, but there's certain requirements for bipartisan support for that legislation. So there's stuff, every single day that we're in Congress, we're voting on that, it's the things that don't always make the news, but things to help veterans get their benefits and lots of good legislation, the things that you might learn on a visit to a business in your district, some, just very small tweak in a federal law or regulation that, could make things better for businesses or someone in your district. A lot of those things, get passed on bills that are called suspensions. And they receive, broad bipartisan support, or even if we do take a recorded vote on them, it's unanimous, overwhelmingly in support of those pieces of legislation. So those are happening a lot. Big ticket things, I think, that we really, hope to be working on coming up is infrastructure. I would say that's at the top. And, I could turn it over to Brian and you can respond kind of what's at the top of your wish list for the next weeks or months.
Sure. No, I agree. I mean, I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That's one of my committee assignments. I certainly hope that that's going to be an area where we can get something big and something that's bipartisan accomplished. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Oval Office with President Biden and Vice President Harris and Secretary Buttigieg to discuss this very issue. They invited a small group of us, and they made clear that they wanted this to be a bipartisan initiative. What we expressed to them is that we want it to be bipartisan too, but bipartisanship to us means involving us at the ground level rather than bringing us in at the end. And that applies no matter which party you're a member of, no matter what the issue is. So we just relayed that because one of the things that we've been a little bit concerned about is that a lot of things that have been advancing to the floor, yes, we voted for it. Elaine mentioned two immigration bills, the Farm Worker Modernization Act and the DREAM Act. I voted for both, but we weren't necessarily brought into the fold on that. And we'd like to see that happen more often, specifically with infrastructure. So it was a good initial sign that we were invited, there were three of us, three Republicans on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that the president invited to meet with him in the Oval Office to discuss this. So that's a good first step. I got a phone call from Secretary Buttigieg, as well as the counselor to President Biden. So I have their cell numbers now. They have mine. They know how to reach us. Hopefully we engage in that conversation early, and we can be together on this from the ground floor up. Great.
John, over to you for any questions before we get to the.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, I think we are. I think it's about time for audience input here. So we've got some questions that are being sent to us, forwarded to us, and like we said up top, it's going to be difficult to get to everybody's questions. We only have about 15 minutes or so, but we'll get a few good ones in. Starting with this one here. Okay, we've got a question. Says here, I'm planning to send my senators and representatives emails requesting them to join the Problem Solvers Caucus. Okay, so we've got some increased support for the caucus here. Is there anything else I can do to encourage them to do so? What's the best way for folks to lead on maybe some of your more intransigent colleagues? Maybe I shouldn't say that, but what are some ways in which people can encourage politicians other than yourselves to take a lead in working across the aisle?
Well, I think like this, many other issues, the more they hear from constituents in their district that it's really a priority from the people who elected them to work on a particular issue, or in this case, to be bipartisan and work across the aisle. I think that is a good start to make them understand that people are really looking and watching and, want to know that their member of Congress is, working across the aisle. And through a group such as Problem Solvers, there are other groups. I'm part of a bipartisan veterans caucus as well. And then, depending on each state, different state delegations, we meet very regularly, our full state delegation, all 11 members of the House and both senators. So, I'd ask them, the Problem Solvers Caucus, it's the largest bipartisan caucus in the House. But if you're not part of that, are you part of any other bipartisan groups that meet regularly and try to work either on broad issues or specific issues?
Indeed. And Congressman Fitzpatrick, anything you'd like to add to that question, to that point?
No, Elaine's right. The most effective form of advocacy for any issue, including this one, is to find constituents in the district, the more the better, who are making the specific ask, and they're following up, not just making the ask and disappearing, but following up with staff, following up with the members, saying, how are we making out on this? Are you concerned? Is there any questions we can answer? Because, a lot of times, and I know probably both of your organizations have, grassroots supporters in each of the 435 congressional districts. Get them active. I mean, if they want to know how they can engage. Now with Zoom, there's not a whole lot of excuses for members not to be willing to take constituent meetings. They can't claim that they're out of town, right? Because you can always get them. So call them out on that. And, any representative that's doing his or her job, if they have a constituent group that wants to meet with them on an issue like this, it's just important. They really should be taking that meeting, and that's when you should start putting the pressure on.
Indeed. Let's see here. Ryan, I don't know if you see one that stands out to you. I have a question here. It says, maybe I missed it, but does the Problem Solvers Caucus only consist of House members versus Senate members? So this is just a detailed question. Is the Problem Solvers Caucus in both houses of Congress, or are we just in the House of Representatives, for those who don't know?
So the Problem Solvers Caucus is the name for our group in the House.
Okay.
No Labels is a broader group that brings together the Problem Solvers Caucus with also a bipartisan group of senators as well. So the Problem Solvers is just the House group, and No Labels is a broad bipartisan and bicameral group that brings us all together regularly.
Yeah, and John, the analogous Senate committee is called the Common Sense Caucus. They're not as big as us, but we're working on that.
Here's one great question we got from one of the participants, and the question is this. I've heard that many in Congress are complaining that they would like to get back to regular order which means getting away from this practice of leadership, taking away a lot of the control from committees and rank and file members, and having really almost full control sometimes as to what gets put on the floor, how things get debated. Can you talk a little bit about that, both of you? Just what regular order is and how Congress has been drifting away from that in the last couple of years? Maybe Congressman Fitzpatrick, you want to start?
Sure. So regular order is a bill gets introduced, it gets considered by committee. It goes through what they call markup in committee. They have hearings. They interview witnesses. Both the majority and minority party and the committee get to call witnesses. They get put on the record. The bill is marked up. Amendments are offered, and then goes to the Rules Committee. And more amendments can be added, which, in a normal course would get a full up or down floor vote. When you don't do regular order, it's all the complete opposite. It's complete top-down governance. The leadership, House leadership determines whether or not something is going to get a markup, or whether or not something is going to be subject to amendment, or whether it's just going to be put on the floor after one individual or one organization or one party drafts a bill. And it's never okay, no matter who does it, no matter who controls the majority. So that's the difference. The way the system is set up is to realize that when a bill is first drafted, that a lot of new facts will be uncovered. A lot of things need to be learned from people that may take a different view. And the bill can be improved, and it can be massaged, and it can be a living, breathing document going through committee and ultimately result in the best legislative product that's put on the floor, where Elaine and I can vote yay or nay on. We can make a decision based on what's in the best interest of our districts. But that's not what we've been seeing, unfortunately, lately. And I will say both parties have been guilty of this.
Congresswoman, any thoughts you want to add?
I think Brian gave an excellent explanation. I think the part that you would just feel like is missing, that, without regular orders, that, everyone on both sides of the aisle has an opportunity to offer amendments, to have a full consideration and vote on those amendments. And, when bills are passed through with, what's considered a closed rule or a modified closed rule, there's a whole bunch of different descriptive adjectives for them, but basically they're not a rule where everyone's amendments would be considered and voted on. Then that, really, I think, doesn't allow each member of Congress to feel like they could have an input, especially to a major piece of legislation. So, I would advocate for regular order and a process where it's fully considered, and, the opportunity to put in amendments in committee, debate the bill, do it again with amendments on the floor. And I think that you can come up with a product where everyone feels like they've had an input, and then at that point they can decide to vote it up or down. But they have had an opportunity to help be part of crafting the piece of legislation.
Okay. Now I have a question here that I am sure is frequently on people's minds, and maybe it's something that each of you have given a little bit of thought to. Earlier in the event, Congressman Fitzpatrick, I think that you mentioned that you and Elaine are the workhorses, not the show horses. You're not the folks who are out there to make a big splash in cable news. But we have a questioner asking what can be done about the 24-hour news channels that are further dividing this country, with views that are further to the left or right than the majority of folks in this country. And like many other Americans, this individual has concerns about the extreme rhetoric coming from the media. How does that interact with the work that you guys do? And are there, how do you advise folks who want to support your work in terms of how they can do that in the face of the polarization industry that we see coming through some of the media channels that we're aware of?
You want me to go first?
Sure thing. Okay. I'm sorry, I pull these things up like jump.
I'll go first, but I'll actually go back and I'll quote Brian from something he said at the very beginning. There's folks in Congress who come here to be workhorses, and then there's like show horses. They just, I feel like it's more important for them to be seen, to be heard, and in a lot of cases, especially more recent, create controversy. Well, the truth of it is, things with controversy, things that are, controversial, or things that sell headlines, right? There's some sort of controversy, there's some sort of suspense, there's some sort of tension. That's what sells headlines. It sold headlines in print papers. Today, it's like literally keeping people glued to their TV on cable news networks, or it's the leading headline if you're reading a news feed, on your computer, or, either some sort of social media. And, the thing that keeps them on the air is people selling ads. That's how it works for the networks. And so, I think that I don't know. I shouldn't have gone first because I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. How do we calm it down? Because I think human nature is to gravitate towards things that they find, interesting. And the confrontation is something that, people can follow with some sort of suspense or interest. And that's what sells headlines. And, I think that folks like Brian and I are not the ones, like we are occasionally, but not the ones regularly, on the headline news. But, my focus is really to talk to people directly in my district. For every time I've gone on a national news show, I've done 150 interviews of different sorts in my district, either with my local TV station or my local high school newspaper, and everything in between, because, I'm really focused on talking to people in my district. I don't think that helps solve the bigger national problem of, how the cable networks have become divisive, but I've really prioritized my efforts on talking to the people who elected me and who I represent, and who I need to hear from and need to hear about the work that I'm doing. So maybe Brian has a better answer how to solve the problem.
No, that's just fine.
Yeah, you had referenced metrics earlier. A good metric would be for any legislator, any member of Congress, I should say, compare their number of TV appearances to the number of bills they've introduced and gotten through one or both of the chambers. And if there's a huge disparity, that'll tell you they might be an entertainer and not a legislator. And I will say this, the $1 million question, John, is how to fix the problem. I'm sure many of you have seen the documentary Social Dilemma, where you have literally the creators, many of the ground level creators of social media that are now in crisis mode for the monster that they've created, and the unattended manifestations of what they've created have now become. I wish I knew the solution to 24-hour cable news, to the echo chambers of social media, and so many of these other elements that we're now dealing with, because it really gets into a socioeconomic, I shouldn't say socioeconomic, it gets more into behavioral issues that have made the job of people like me and Elaine even more challenging, because there's not as Elaine referenced, there's really not an appetite on TV or in the media, unfortunately, for two members of Congress from different parties to agree on something. And that's sad. But the reality is that, they much more prefer adversarial kind of bomb throwing. And it's unfortunate, because I feel like we've become conditioned to think in terms of slogans that you can fit on a bumper sticker, rather than really rolling up your sleeves and getting into the details and the nuance to get policy right, so that the policy actually has a positive impact on people's lives, no matter what the issue. But when you're sending across the finish line messaging bills that aren't a product of bipartisan compromise, that haven't gone through committee hearings, that haven't had the witnesses show up before a committee to testify about what the positives and negatives of that proposal are, then we're not really serious about fixing the problem. It's more messaging to a particular base than it is actually rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work to get a policy right. Because when Elaine and I go up to the box, we're given a yes and a no option, when the fact is the way these bills are advanced, yes or no isn't reflective of how we're feeling. A lot of times it's yes, but or no, but. And I wish we could get bills on the floor of the House and make it a much clearer yes or no decision. And that's really what we're looking for. Social media, 24-hour cable news have complicated the problem for us. And that's why we feel that what we need to do is expand the influence of our caucus in both chambers to actually drive the legislative decision-making.
Indeed. And you referenced the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix about the effect of social media on polarization. For folks who are interested, you can hear Tristan Harris on the Braver Angels podcast coming up in a couple of weeks or so. And we actually have the opportunity to chat with him a little bit about our work on the Humane Tech podcast, which is his organization. So thank you for that reference. We had a question about that here in the chat. This has been fantastic. Ryan, do you see a closing, do you see a good note that we might be able to fish out of the question basket here? Is there something you would like to offer up as we come to our final couple of minutes? Because we know that our guests are on the clock, working hard for the people.
Let's really quickly, let's leave on a high note. A lot of things to be frustrated, fearful about. Can you just tell us something that makes you feel optimistic about what's ahead in Washington? Congresswoman Luria, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, like I said, I visit a lot of places around my district. And the other morning I went back to one of the schools in one of the areas of my district that for a variety of reasons has not been in person until very recently. And, all of the teachers were standing out front, and to see those children running back into the classroom, going back to school in person, the principal said to me, usually I tell them, walk, don't run. Kids were literally running back into the classroom. And the idea that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, I think we're not going to ever really truly defeat everything to do with COVID. We're going to have to learn to live with it in our midst. But the fact that with the vaccines getting out, the children getting back in school, just some sense of normalcy over the horizon is something that, I'm very optimistic about. And I think, most people in the country are just ready for that. They're ready to get back together with their loved ones, for their kids to be in school. And, we're still working hard to put all those pieces together and get the resources out to folks in the community to do that and help protect the jobs and the small businesses out there. And just throwing into that as well, I speak to a small business owner who'll say, I would have never made it through without, the payroll protection program or some of the other funding we were able to do in the CARES Act and those kind of things. And to think that, for people who often don't really pay a whole lot of attention to what we do in Washington at all, that we've been able to get like tangible results to people who saved their businesses, where they've invested their livelihood. And they feel like these employees are not just employees, but family. And we've been able to help them get through this really difficult time, and that there's a light on the other side. I mean, those are the kind of things that give me optimism and make me want to keep working at what we're doing in Washington.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you again for being with us. Congressman Fitzpatrick, feel-good note for the group before we leave.
Yeah, Ryan, well, as you know, I'm a product of Philadelphia, and my favorite iconic figure out of Philadelphia is Rocky Balboa. My favorite Rocky was Rocky V, when he was training a young fighter, and this fighter kept asking, Rocky, teach me how to hit hard. I want to learn how to hit really hard. And his favorite line of all the movies of Rocky was, he said, it's not how hard you can hit. It's how hard you can get hit and get back up again. It's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. And if you look at the history of the United States, one historical fact that is unequivocally true is every time we've been hit, we've come back stronger. We're coming out of a pandemic now, hopefully. If you look at the last pandemic we had in the awful flu that we had in the early 1900s, it was followed by the Roaring 20s. You go back, no matter which challenge we face in our country, we've come back roaring, literally. And I think we're going to see that again, because history tells us that has happened each and every time we face that as a country. What's the hope? Elaine said it's in the kids, and I couldn't agree more. They're my motivation. It's my favorite group to talk to. And I love all you, don't get me wrong. But the most motivating group that I can speak to, and I know Elaine agrees, are the young people, because you see the future in their eyes. You see this pure optimism. And that's where people like Elaine and I draw our inspiration from. And that's where we're going to continue to draw our inspiration. And that's what motivates us, as hard as this job can be. And it is, believe me. When you have the philosophy like Elaine and I have of centrism, you get licks from the left and the right. And sometimes it feels like a very lonely, very quiet place. But we see, typically on election day, but usually other than that, that's where most people are. You may not hear from them every day. They may not call and thank you. They may not be out there protesting or, positive or negative, but they're out there and they do appreciate it. And we appreciate you guys for being bridge builders. And that's the note I'd like to leave it on, Ryan. We live in a time when you have a lot of people around you that want to burn down bridges. It's incumbent upon every one of us, certainly members of Congress, certainly elected leaders, but leaders and families and churches and schools, no matter what you're a leader in your own little pocket in life, to be a leader and a bridge builder. If each one of us do our job, I think we'll be heading in the right direction.
Indeed. Well, thank you both for letting us draw a little bit of inspiration from each of you. And it's just a pleasure to be able to share this time with you this evening, and very grateful once again. So until next time, our folks are looking forward to supporting you all. Thank you so much. All right.